to Made in Science, the official podcast of the University of Stuttgart. I happen to think that some of the best stories in life come directly to us, and Made in Science makes sure to share them with our audience. Therefore, for today, we have invited a very special guest who comes from a country sometimes called Down Under, but who is at the very top when it comes to inspiring literary research here at the University of Stuttgart. The name of the guest is Dr. Geoff Rodoreda of Australia, and the name of the author he has been interested in the last years is George Orwell of Britain. Let us begin our time travel and draw the connection between these two gentlemen. Geoff, a very warm welcome to Made in Science.
Thanks very much, Wolfgang.
Geoff, you work at the Institute of Literary Studies and especially in English literatures and cultures here at the university campus downtown. Your focus and your work is on post-colonial literature and culture, especially Australian, and on Indigenous literatures, but also film and media studies. Now, against this wide background, it is not surprising at all that you would every now and then attend a book exhibition. But how come that attending a book exhibition became a kind of game changer in your recent work and life?
Yes, about 2 years ago, I was attending a book fair here in Stuttgart, and stumbled across a small table by a small publisher from Freiburg in the bottom corner of Germany, but in the same state of Baden-Württemberg, of which Stuttgart's the capital. And they had a number of books on the table, and it got me interested and in a conversation with the person behind, from this publishing house, behind the stand. And it was a series of books that were about famous people, if you like, cultural figures who'd visited this state of Baden-Württemberg. So there was something on, Hemingway and the Black Forest, and there was something on Schumann in Baden-Baden, and something on Mark Twain on the Neckar, and so forth. And these were published in German, but I got into a conversation with the person behind the desk, and I said, did you know that George Orwell, the British writer, the author of 1984, of Animal Farm and so forth, was in the city of Stuttgart? And they looked at me astounded and thought I was, some kind of idiot, before I got into a conversation with them about the fact that George Orwell, that famous writer, in 1945, at the beginning of 1945, spent 3 months as a war reporter. Among all the other things he did in his life, he spent 3 months as a war reporter based in Paris, and he made a number of trips into Germany to visit Cologne, for example, to visit Nuremberg or near Nuremberg, and he visited this city of Stuttgart as well. And from that visit, at the very end of the World War II, he wrote two pieces, an essay and a news report about what he'd seen on the immediate occupation of the city by the French and American troops who took it on the 21st, 22nd of April, 1945 from the Nazi rulers at the time. This story then, and this conversation with this book publisher transpired over the coming weeks in the following weeks with emails and phone calls, and eventually they asked me to write, if I would be interested in writing a book that would fit into that series that I'd seen of Hemingway and Twain and others. Would I be interested in writing a book about George Orwell's visit to Germany and his work as a war correspondent in that period? And I set about writing that book, spent some time off my normal teaching work writing that, and it was published in April or May this year.
Mm-hmm. And in your research, I think you went through not only to book exhibitions then, I guess, but also to many, many libraries. What became the center of your attention? What key aspects did you decide actually to follow?
So my interest in Orwell, in teaching George Orwell's works as a literary scholar and as a teacher here at the University of Stuttgart was actually my first entry into teaching literary studies. About 15 years ago, when I started at the university, I was invited to put together a literary studies course, and I knew quite a bit of Orwell's work. But it was in reading further of his work that I stumbled across this sentence where he'd written something like, "And with a Belgian journalist, I crossed a bridge and entered the city of Stuttgart." And I looked at that sentence, I thought, huh? What? This city that I teach in, that we have a university in? And I tried to find out whether people knew about this in cities' cultural institutions, at the university and other places. No one really had a clue that this famous author had visited this city in 1945. And that prompted me at that time, apart from putting together my seminar, to research into these two pieces of writing where he'd mentioned Stuttgart during the war or at the very end of the war, and to try to research, are there some places he mentions that we could locate perhaps today that might be still standing? He mentions a house that he visited. Am I able to find out the house that he stayed in? No was the answer to that. It was too vague in the references. But one mention in particular, actually two mentions in both of these two pieces, was of a footbridge that he mentioned crossing here in Stuttgart to enter the city. And there were various other clues that I pieced together. I went into the archive, the city's archives as well, spent numbers of days searching there in the archives because I was interested to try to find if there was a listing of various bridges that were still standing at the end of the war that hadn't been destroyed, either by Allied bombings or, unfortunately, as happens, a retreating army, the Nazi army, the leaders, the commanders of Stuttgart, blew up all the bridges that were still there standing just a day or two before they fled the city with the encroaching Allied troops. But there was one footbridge I discovered that had not been blown up, and I was able, with other documentation, to match that, yes, indeed, this was the footbridge that George Orwell did cross to enter the city across the river that flows through here, the Neckar. And that footbridge still stands, and it's called the Bergersteg, the Berger bridge, footbridge. And so since that time, I've now taken students out when I do an Orwell course now, or a course on British cultural studies. We have one day where we do an excursion out to that bridge and stand there on the bridge, and they have to read the reports and get a feel, if you like, for living literature, if you like. This author was here and he crossed this bridge. And that research then was eventually then what led to the writing of the book, that initial research. I also traveled for this particular book. I had to gather some more information about Orwell's time here in Germany. I traveled to Paris with the thankful help of the head of our department to do a research trip to Paris to visit the place where he was staying as a journalist while he was in Paris in 1945 as a war reporter. And I also then took photographs and various pieces of documentation there. And I travelled to England to visit the Orwell archive, which sits at the University College London in London.
In your book, you mention that Orwell often thought out particularly transitional societies and also conflict zones. Why was he drawn to Germany at that particular time in history, in the spring of 1945?
Yes, he was working more or less as a freelance journalist. He was actually employed as principally a book reviewer by a journal in London at that time. And as the war drew to an end, Orwell had expressed interest to a number of friends. Oh, wouldn't it be interesting to try to discover more about the totalitarian nature of Germany, or of what's going on the continent of occupied Europe, occupied by the German Nazi rulers at that time. But that didn't seem to come to fruition until he was contacted by an editor at the Observer newspaper in London. That's a weekly Sunday newspaper, a large and important investigative newspaper in England. And an editor there named David Astor was a friend of George Orwell's, and he asked him whether he wouldn't be interested in going to the continent, to base himself in Paris first of all, to be a correspondent, a war correspondent for the Observer. He linked up with another newspaper, the Manchester Evening News. And so with those two newspapers providing with some money and funding, obviously, to do this work, he travelled to Paris in mid-February 1945, and that got him going here on the continent. That was the process of his reporting that he then continued over a 3-month period.
And here in Stuttgart, he became also, I think, a witness of the French army in Stuttgart and a kind of conflict with the French and the American army, who was just about to come to Stuttgart.
Yes, one of the fascinating aspects of his visit to Stuttgart was that he arrived at exactly the moment with American troops. He arrived from one side of the city with embedded as a reporter with American troops. And he arrived with those troops just one day or a few hours actually after French forces of the Allied command had come at the city from the west or from the other side of the city as the Americans. And the idea of these two major forces was to enclose the city of Stuttgart, to wait until both troops were stationed to pincer the city, so to speak, so no Nazi rulers or commanders could flee the city, and then for both armies to encroach upon the city. But the clear rule of the Allied command was that the American army would mount or would post up what are so-called proclamations around the city, announcing, curfews and that kind of thing, that they would bring the city of Stuttgart under their command. However, the French had encountered less resistance than the American army in encroaching the city and arrived actually a day ahead of schedule. And the French forces ultimately did not have an interest in allowing this prize city to be captured by, their allies, but also their rivals in many ways, the American army. And so they decided to enter the city contrary actually to Allied command, and they took the city and took command of it. But the problem was the French didn't have the proclamation, the military police ready to institute straight away to stop the city from essentially being plundered from within. And so while they had taken the city, they hadn't properly set up order in the place. So within the first 24 or 48 hours of the city, the Americans arrived as well. There was absolute chaos in the city. Not just chaos, but there was quite horrific violence. There are estimated to be something like 1,500 women, according to official reports later, women and girls were raped, either by French forces, but also possibly by others, by people freed from concentration camps or camps, forced labor camps around the place, as well as possibly by German men in the city. And the city was plundered, the wine cellars were raided, smashed glasses lay all around the place. And Orwell actually was an eyewitness to history of this moment, because in his first reports, he reports on this chaos. He didn't know, like a lot of reporters didn't know, about what was going on behind the scenes with the rape and other violent acts against German civilians that were carried out. But he reported on the chaos of the city at that time. And it was a major international scandal, because behind the scenes, the Americans complained to Charles de Gaulle in Paris, who was effectively more or less in charge of a de facto French government at the time, and pleaded with him to hand over the city to the American commanders. He refused to do that for a number of weeks, until the Americans eventually in July 1945 did take command of the city. And this city then was in the American zone of post-war reconstruction, as Germany was pretty much divided up into zones of, not occupation, but zones of administration and management in the immediate post-war years.
Had Orwell been a war correspondent prior to coming to Stuttgart in other regions of the Second World War?
He hadn't done what we might call daily journalism. He hadn't done writing where he had to basically research and write something and send it off to his editors on the day that it was written, more or less. So he was someone who started doing this reporting in Paris. He did make a trip to Cologne, beforehand. He did make a trip to near Nuremberg. He traveled with American troops through the Bavarian countryside and reported as well, before he arrived in Stuttgart, on a small town being taken by American troops. And he reported in Stuttgart he had experienced war before because he was in London during the so-called Blitz of the German bombers that bombed cities, not just in London, but across England in 1940-41. He also traveled to and fought actually as a soldier in the Spanish Civil War in 1936-37 on the side of small socialist or anarchist groups against Franco's fascist forces in the Spanish Civil War. And he actually got wounded on the front in the war. And he wrote a book about that. He wasn't there as a war reporter, but he did write a book afterwards, published a couple of years later in England, called Homage to Catalonia. And that's one of his famous works of non-fiction writing that kind of placed him as a serious, politically active, politically aware and savvy journalist or essayist from that work. So he'd experienced war. He'd experienced certainly reporting before, but not the daily tough task of getting all your notes together and writing things off. So in the archives in England, I've found where various of his editors at that time were complaining a bit or a little bit annoyed or a little bit frustrated that Orwell hasn't quite got it yet. He hasn't quite got the idea of taking notes quickly and sending things off to us, but we're sure he'll come good and he'll write some other things, some more what you would call in journalism color pieces or feature stories. And the 20 newspaper stories that he wrote during that 3-month period for these 2 newspapers in England proved indeed to be more feature kind of pieces that did color out the mainstream or the main war reporting that occurred in those 2 newspapers, the Observer and the Manchester Evening News in England. So he functioned as a kind of a feature writer, let's say, rather than a, crunch journalist, sort of a daily news reporter in that work.
And he certainly came up with some other literary work, that is for sure. I think one of the novels that you mentioned is 1984. Now, can you, from your findings, say and show and give evidence that there is a connection somehow between Orwell and his time, what he saw in Germany, the time he lived through, before, also perhaps prior, coming to Germany, and that particular novel?
That's one of my interests in doing this research into George Orwell's time as a war correspondent just for 3 months at the beginning of 1945. As a literary studies scholar, I was particularly interested to see whether there are any links between his war reporting work, his experiences in Germany as he wrote them down and reported and wrote in letters to friends and various other documentation of his writing and experiences here, to see whether there's a connection to that immediate visceral experience for him. I mean, it touched a nerve with him. He was shocked at the devastation that he encountered here in Germany, in the towns and cities. He was shocked at the, if you like, the low caste, the depressed state of the people, the civilian population that he experienced. He was shocked at the prospect that some Allied armies were talking about of trying to keep Germany, if you like, sort of in the gutter economically in the post-war years. And instead, he favoured a policy of reintegration of Germany into the family of European nations. And instead of punishing Germany with reparation payments, instead he favoured and wrote very much about the need to actually fund German development then again. And actually he's borne out then later to have been on the side of history, because the Marshall Plan, of course, then pumped billions into the reconstruction of post-war continental Europe, but in particular of Germany. Orwell's connection to 1984 is quite interesting, I found, because what we discover is that he had not started writing this novel until immediately after he arrives back from his war reporting work in in Germany. There is documentation to show that he starts writing the first 12 pages of 1984 sometime in June in 1945, that is to say in the immediate time of his return to England. And I was interested to investigate, is there something in his war reporting work that we see, if you like, flows into or that we can see traces of in 1984? We do know that Orwell actually had the plan to write 1984 before he arrived here as a war correspondent. He was inspired by the meeting of the so-called Big Three, Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt in Tehran in December 1943. So during the war, when they met in Tehran to, if you like, kind of divide up a post-war Europe among themselves as the allies who at that point now looked like they were going to win the war. And Orwell thought this was quite crass, that Europe would be divided up in this kind of way. And there are notebook entries from 1943, 1944, which show that he had a basic layout for this novel he would later construct that was to become 1984. But he had not started writing it. And so I was interested to look at 1984, which I've taught a number of times, and to sort of look through it more carefully to see, are there some influences there from his writings? And I discovered what I think are three areas which basically build into his the overall sort of totalitarian feel of 1984, the London that he constructs, of a future London that he creates in that novel, writing it, of course, in 1946, 47, 48, 49, just before his death, but projecting it 30 plus years into the 1980s in a future dystopian world of London. The chaos that ensues in that city, the continual bombing, the dilapidation of the apartments, of the buildings, we see that reflected very much in his writings, for example, from his war reporting work. The way he described the German cities, for me, has very, very strong similarities to the way that the feeling of London that we get there. Plus, the feeling of the people that he describes. And maybe one other element that's important is one of the key figures in that novel, 1984, is the figure of O'Brien. O'Brien is, if you like, the main antagonist to the protagonist, Winston Smith, the main character in the novel. And O'Brien is the person who lures Winston into thinking that he's safe in talking to him. But O'Brien turns out to be one of the regime's henchmen. And actually he ends up being Winston's torturer in the novel. And this, when we look at Orwell's war reporting work, we actually find his association with a few German people that he describes, but a particular scene when he describes visiting a prisoner of war camp somewhere in southern Germany. He doesn't name exactly the place, where he comes into contact with some officers who are prisoners of war. And in that relation, there are very similar, interesting descriptions to exactly the descriptions that fit O'Brien, the character of O'Brien. So my thesis is, and this hasn't been put forward before in Orwell studies or in research into this novel, but I'm interested in writing this up in English because I've only written it in German. But to argue that through various elements of his war reporting work, including the creation of the figure O'Brien in 1984, we see traces, we see elements of his writing emerge from his war reporting work into that novel.
Yeah, you mentioned the two so far, and I think this is the dystopian London that we see in 1984. We see the characters that you have just mentioned. What is the third one?
So that would be the aspect of the divided world that is constructed in 1984. This might be hard to argue for those who know the book very well, and I need to do good convincing work when I write this eventually up in English. But the way that Orwell divides up the world in 1984, in that novel, he has three major sectors of the world. And this was a major theme in his war reporting work. He actually saw the way in which, at the time, he thought, as the French army came into a part of Germany and occupied it, as the Americans came in, as the British came in, as the Russians came in from the East, what they were all doing, and what was actually supposed to be standard rule, was to raise, for example, all of the flags when they occupied a city or a town of all of the Allied armies. So if you're the French army, you arrive, you raise the American flag. Obviously, you're going to raise the French flag, the American flag, the British flag, and the Russian flag, because they're your allies in this command. Likewise, that other powers would do this. But what he noticed, for example, at Stuttgart, was we only saw the French flag raised. In other parts of Germany that he saw occupied by troops, not only was it about flags, but he saw armies occupying areas that he feared would then become divided areas, so that Germany wouldn't be unified after the war, but would actually be divided up in these zones of, let's say, military administration would become zones of occupation, that they might in fact become different countries under the rule of these occupying powers. And that was not something he wanted to happen. He saw that as a dangerous precedent. Now, he didn't know that that was not to come to pass. Those zones of administration then did lead into countries being formed. But I argue that he brings those fears of a divided continental Europe into the world that he projects in 1984. So a destroyed dystopian landscape and people, a divided world that is divided up in the novel 1984, and in particular certain characters, but in particular the figure of O'Brien is, in my view, drawn, not completely, but is drawn. We can see traces of those from his war reporting work that flow into 1984.
Orwell, the reporter, and also Rodoreda, the reporter. You have worked prior to coming to us here at the university as a journalist in Australia and other countries. So how important is this link? You have given us some connection already between what Orwell, the reporter, experienced and saw firsthand, and then modified into his fiction. And you have developed your theory about it. How important is such a formula for literature in general in your mind? Is it quite often the case? Does it happen only now and then? What are the implications? Is it necessary at all, or is a totally uninvolved personal experience actually more relevant? What is your view on literature from that point of view?
I think, having worked as a journalist for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in Australia in a total of roughly 7 years in different cities, before moving to Germany in the late 1990s, and having worked as a freelance journalist here, principally English language freelance journalist here in Germany for a number of years before I came to the university, that, of course, you could say I've worked as a professional writer. So I've worked as a writer who's been paid to do that laborious work of the kind of reporting, the kind of daily reporting that I was explaining before that Orwell rarely had to do and had to try to really perfect while he was a reporter here. I've been involved in that, and I guess that gives you a certain perspective. I don't know if it's a better perspective or a more overview perspective. But I would say it gives me a certain perspective into Orwell's literary works then, because he's worked as a journalist and reporter. He principally is known, actually most of his writings are not his novels, but his non-fiction work, his journalism, his literary essay writing work that he's also read today for. And I guess that gives me some kind of perspective into writing. And I guess in particular on this phase of writing that he experienced in Germany. I was quite astounded to read through, of course, the various biographies, the various other writings about Orwell, about his time here in Germany, or about his life overall, and found that, frankly, most of the biographers, almost all the biographers, with a couple of little exceptions and writers about his work, almost completely ignore this 3-month period when he was a war reporter here, which is wonderful for me because I can look into it and investigate it and bring something hopefully new to the investigation of this author. But most dismiss it as something that was relatively irrelevant to his work overall. Because principally there are various reasons for that, but one of the main ones would be because it was just, so to speak, quote unquote, simple reporting work. Of course, he was writing rather, fact-based, fact-laden kind of reports. They were not, flowery, essayistic, aesthetically nice, so to speak, writing, documentation of his work. So it's often seen as, they were little minor things he did, but they don't measure up to his other forms of writing. So they've largely been dismissed for that period of time. And so his work has not been considered from that perspective. So maybe because I've worked as a reporter and see the affinity in the kind of work he does there as important, that I'm particularly interested in this phase of his life.
Now, you completed your PhD in 2016 with a study on post-colonial discourses in contemporary Australian fiction. And let's talk about the Australian fiction and your interest in Australian history and Indigenous culture for a moment. Your dissertation earned 2 awards, the Association of Anglophone Post-Colonial Studies Best PhD in 2018, and the Association for Australian Studies Best PhD also in 2018. And then a monograph, The Mabo Turn in Australian Fiction, was awarded the inaugural Egan Award 2019 for the best first book of literary scholarship on an Australian subject. You cover I would know this very well, in our English program and study program in particular, quite a bit of Australian literature. Students here at the university certainly come in contact with Indigenous Australian literature only from a cultural and geographical distance. How do they tend to approach these texts, I wonder, and how can you help them in this process to understand the context and content of these texts better?
That's a difficult task. And hopefully it gets better with practice over the years. Maybe when I did my first courses on Australian history, Australian culture, Australian literature, maybe I didn't give enough background to students. But I'm interested if I'm teaching, let's say, a course on Australian literature. I'm teaching one this semester, for example, called Rewriting Australia, Land, History, Truth-Telling, which is principally looking at historical novels, mostly historical novels that have, for example, sought to retell the story of Australia's colonisation against the myths that pretty much prevailed up until even just 40, 50 years ago in Australia. And those myths were that in Australia, there was a largely peaceful settlement by the British. No, that it's New Zealand's Maori Indigenous peoples who were the quote unquote warlike of Indigenous peoples, and the British had a lot of trouble trying to settle, quote unquote, or conquer New Zealand. But in Australia, there was so much land, and the Aborigines kind of just moved, the Indigenous people in Australia kind of just moved out the way, more or less. Of course, there were deaths from disease and European-brought diseases, and that did, of course, cause much death across Indigenous cultures in Australia on first contact with Europeans, because they didn't have immunity to those diseases. But otherwise, so the story goes, those people more or less kind of made space or moved away, or this idea, they kind of just died out against the onslaught of European progress and European settlement of the country. Historical research from the 1960s, 70s and 80s and beyond has really shown that there was much more violence on the frontier in the Australian context than had up to that point been investigated, so that there were horrific massacres of Indigenous peoples across the country consistently. The violence against Indigenous cultures has been documented by leading historical researchers. And what's interesting for me is that also has come to be written about by Australia's authors and novelists in particular. So that they are writing about a different story, a different narrative of frontier. It's not the heroic pioneer chopping down trees and creating a land from nothing. The story has turned to show the way in which that so-called heroic pioneer was actually involved more than likely in killing of Aboriginal people, in kicking them off their land, so that we nowadays really need to speak not of settlement, but of invasion, of the conquering of a continent by the British. And this bears itself out in many, many literary texts of the 2000s and of the 1990s and before. And these are the texts I'm interested in bringing to a readership here. I guess the connection in Germany, you can make a connection about how do you deal with your past? You know, how do you re-narrate the nation, especially in Germany after the horrific murder of 6 million Jews, especially in the war? What does a nation do to, if it can ever, so to speak, come to terms with that horror and recalibrate itself into a different kind of place? And Australia is kind of going through, in a sense, this on a different kind of scale in Australia in coming to terms with its history. I mean, I seek, for example, if I'm doing a course on this, not to investigate the first novel of Australia in the first 1 or 2 weeks, but maybe after 2 or 3 weeks of providing background, some historical background, some cultural background, so that students then, by the time we read the first of the literary texts, hopefully they've got a bit of an idea of how to contextualize this.
Are there any markers that indicate this recalibration, as you called it, that to you as an Australian are meaningful? I certainly remember the Sydney Olympics in the year 2000, and I do recall Cathy Freeman's performance there. But she was also the one to come up with the torch and gave light to the Olympic flame in the stadium. Such a moment, and especially the background of Cathy Freeman as well. Does this mean something for Australia's recalibration, redefinition into a more in a more diverse understanding, I guess, of its own past?
Those events like the Sydney Olympics are especially important in the year 2000 because they're in the international spotlight. Yeah. So, an Indigenous Australian runner, Cathy Freeman, a brilliant world-class sprinter who actually won the gold medal in the 400 meters final for women in Sydney, on the Sydney track, in front of a home audience, so to speak, a very proud moment for her and, of course, for the country. The fact that she is an Indigenous Australian athlete lights the Olympic torch or is involved in the opening and closing ceremonies is very important. And that signals to the world that Australia is starting to recognise that Indigenous, or as a nation, that Indigenous people in the country have other roles to play than just being sort of sidelined to history or forgotten about, or not being, or their culture and history of 60,000 years on the continent. It's still the oldest living cultures on Earth. So Australia has something special and something important that could be, talked about and narrativized in another way. And steps like the Sydney Olympics are moves towards this, but there's never really an event where there's kind of a line drawn in the sand. There are kind of ups and downs in this process. There are what you might call political pluses and then political setbacks, so that the story of further recognition of Indigenous presence on the continent and continuing survival and their rights, for example, their claims to sovereignty over the continent, have received setbacks in more recent years. But where you have an international spotlight focusing on events in Australia, that's when, of course, Australia as a nation wants to show itself, its government and its rulers want to show themselves in a positive light to the world. And then those kinds of steps are made, and they're not to be downplayed, but they don't signal what often is going on underneath or in the ground or internally. Things can head in other directions depending on the signs of the time, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, Geoff, thanks to you. the very aspect, shedding light on Australian literature and culture and history, in the subject of English has certainly taken momentum over more than a decade now, 15 years, something like that. So that is quite a significant contribution for students of English who want to focus on that particular part of the world. From your perspective, living in Germany, but you're going back quite often, I understand, to Australia as well. How do you see Australia's current literary positioning from a distance, but also when you are in Australia?
I raid the secondhand bookshops with my favorite reader, who's my mum. She knows all the best places to buy books. There is quite a big unlike in Germany, there's quite a big market for secondhand books at various charity stores and so forth and other places. And I love browsing those, of course, and keeping up to date with things, of course, and buying new books, of course, as well. And they're particularly ones I can't get here in Europe already. So that's a way for me to keep up to date. But I also, of course, have continual contact with family and so forth. So those things keep me updated. Plus occasional visits, of course, by family or friends over here in Europe. And you know, I continue, of course, to read, and that is one, you know, major benefit of an internet world, that I'm able pretty much to keep up to date with daily news if I want to.
And how do you perceive it here in Germany? Has Australian literature, the interest in it, but also the research on Australian literature changed?
There are very good networks that still exist that were established 30, 35 years ago with the rise of post-colonial studies of the wider field of Anglophone studies across the world, including in Australian studies and Australian literature. And those associations, those academic organizations, those interested groups continue to function here with conferences and academic work across Europe. The Australian literature has to concede to its relatively small place in the massive world of Anglophone literatures. But many Australian literary texts are, for example, being published and translated into German as we speak, into French, into various European languages, apart from many other languages. So those books are also coming to a reading public more so in Germany, with technologies of translation, but also with the processes of publishing. One perhaps particular interest that is particularly in France, but also in Germany, is a wide interest in the rise of what we have to describe as the rise of the Indigenous Australian novel. There are many, over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a rapid rise in Indigenous Australian writers who are writing novels, who are turning to the form of the novel, away perhaps from other forms or continuing with those, but in particular the novel. And they're winning major literary prizes in Australia for their work, not as Indigenous writers, but as Australian writers. And we're seeing many of those texts now and authors on European tours and so forth. So that may be a window that readers here in whatever language have now into Australia that they mightn't have had 15, 20, 30 years ago.
Thank you for having highlighted that aspect as well. And of course, those of you who would like to find out about that, check out Geoff's Rodoreda's seminars and lectures here at our university. Towards the end of our conversation, we have something called Moment 7. And that means there are 7 questions. And please, we would like to ask you to answer them briefly. Moment 1. Spätzle or Maultaschen?
Vegetarian Maultaschen.
Moment 2. One thing that you could change about the world would be?
It would be a banal answer, but a little more love.
Moment 3. Do you have a recommendation for a book, a movie, music, theater, museum visit in Australia or in Germany?
When I'm in Australia, I always go to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which is a free entry gallery. And although the exhibition more or less, what's exhibited more or less stays the same, it's just a wonderful visit up on the hill in a big parkland in Sydney. And it's one of my favourite places to be when I arrive back.
Moment 4. The best advice that you have ever received was?
Not so much life advice, but advice by a very esteemed scholar who I saw giving a talk once and turning pages back and front the whole time while he talked in this perfect way. And I asked him later, I said, were you reading those pages or what? And he said, no, I wasn't reading them at all. But I needed them there because I was very nervous. And I said, you're not nervous. You've done this 10,000 times. And he said, and this was a piece of advice to me, Geoff, if you're not nervous going into something, you're not taking it seriously. So accept the nervousness of standing up in front of a classroom, appearing before someone, because that's the adrenaline that will drive you to say something constructive or useful or out of the passion of your heart, rather than taking it with oh yeah, I can do that,
Moment 5. Your favorite place here at the University of Stuttgart is?
I will say out in the gardens in front of the gardens when the leaves are falling off the trees in autumn, in front of the city library here at the university, in that garden area, where I've sometimes brought students out in the summer as well to do lessons outdoors, and that's a wonderful place to occupy.
Moment 6. Please finish the sentence. If I could start all over again, I would do the following differently.
I may have worked a bit longer in the reporting jobs that I had in Australia. I worked for 3 years in Adelaide, and I worked for 4 years in Darwin. And I really look back on that time as an exciting time as a young reporter doing the work that I did. Various other things led me to do other things, which I haven't regretted. But if I could do that again, I might have stayed for another year or two in those places as a reporter.
And moment 7. Also, please complete this sentence. Thanks to my studies, I know that
I don't know very much at all. The more I read, the more, of course, I realize the gaps that are there. But yeah, to enjoy the moment of the reading and the study and the reporting or the working that you're doing, to take the moment as it is.
Geoff, thank you for having come to us today and this conversation. And all the very best for your next projects. You mentioned there will be, and you are thinking of, an English version of the book on Orwell. So all the very best and good luck for that one. And of course, as a colleague, for your teaching and research, which I admire a lot in you, and for building the bridges between Australia and Germany here in Stuttgart.
Thank you very much.
And to our audience, please stay tuned for our next conversations that are always based on what is made in science. Plus, we always love to hear from you. If you have any comments and recommendations, please let us know. My name is Wolfgang Holtkamp. Have a great podcast day, and goodbye and good talking.